Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone will stand over a grave and place a single flower on the dirt. They won't think about why they're doing it. It will feel automatic, natural, almost instinctive. But that instinct is older than agriculture, older than writing, older than almost every idea you've ever had about what makes you human. So when did it start? And why does a hairless primate, alone among all the animals on Earth, insist on doing something for the dead that the dead will never know about? Most animals do not bury their own. A herd of elephants will linger near a fallen member, touching the bones with their trunks, but they do not dig. A chimpanzee might sit beside the body of a companion for hours, visibly distressed, but it will not carry stones to cover it. Death, for almost every species on this planet, is simply the end of interaction. The body becomes part of the landscape again. Somewhere along the way, your ancestors broke that rule. The oldest confirmed deliberate burials come from two cave sites in what is now Israel, Kafza and Skul. Around 100,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens placed bodies into pits, some curled into positions that look almost like sleep, some accompanied by objects that had no practical use to a corpse. A deer antler resting in the arms of a child. Ochre, a red pigment, scattered near a skeleton for no functional reason at all. These weren't burials of convenience. Convenience would mean tossing a body into a ravine or leaving it for scavengers, the way most other animals effectively do. This was something else, something deliberate, something that took effort the living didn't need to spend. Why spend that effort? For decades, archaeologists assumed burial required abstract thought, a belief in an afterlife, a concept of the soul continuing on. But the evidence complicates that story, and it complicates it in a fascinating direction. Paul Pettit, an archaeologist at Durham University who has spent much of his career studying the origins of human mortuary behavior, argues that burial likely began not as a religious act, but as a practical and emotional one that only later accumulated symbolic meaning. Covering a body kept scavengers away. It reduced the smell of decomposition in a shared living space. It may have started as basic hygiene, but hygiene doesn't explain the flowers. It doesn't explain the antlers, or the ochre, or the careful positioning of the limbs. Something shifted. And one of the strangest pieces of evidence for that shift doesn't come from Homo sapiens at all. In the 1960s, a Neanderthal burial site called Shanidar Cave, in what is now northern Iraq, produced pollen clusters found near a skeleton. The original excavator, Ralph Selecki, proposed something startling, that Neanderthals had laid flowers with their dead. For decades, the idea captured public imagination, and just as many decades of scientific debate followed, since burrowing rodents can also introduce pollen into a grave site long after burial. But more recent work at Shanidar, led by archaeologist Chris Hunt and his team at Liverpool, John Moores University, uncovered fresh burial deposits with clustered plant material patterns that are difficult to explain through rodent activity alone. The debate isn't fully settled, but the fact that it's even a live scientific question should stop you for a second. Neanderthals, a species you were taught to think of as brutish and simple, may have grieved in ways that looked remarkably like yours. Here's where the story gets stranger still. In 2013, cavers exploring a nearly inaccessible chamber deep inside the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa discovered hundreds of bones belonging to a previously unknown hominin species, later named Homo naledi. The chamber was almost impossible to reach, requiring a narrow vertical squeeze barely wide enough for a human body. There was no evidence the bones had washed in through water, or been dragged in by predators, or fallen through a collapsed opening. Paleoanthropologist Lee Berger and his team proposed something that upended assumptions about the origins of ritual behavior entirely. That Homo naledi, a species with a brain roughly 1/3 the size of yours, may have deliberately carried their dead into that chamber and left them there. Deliberately. Repeatedly. Over generations. If true, and the claim remains actively debated within the field, it would mean that treating the dead with intention did not require a large brain at all. It did not require the kind of abstract, symbolic thinking long assumed to be the exclusive property of modern humans. So what does it require? Maybe just this: attachment. The same neurological wiring that makes you love someone while they're alive doesn't simply switch off the moment their heart stops. Grief, in a sense, is love with nowhere left to go. And for a highly social species, a species that depends entirely on relationships to survive, that leftover love may be unbearable to just leave lying in the open. Consider what your ancestors actually risked by burying their dead. Digging a grave takes time. Time spent digging is time not spent finding food, watching for predators, caring for the living. And yet, across continents, across different hominin species, across tens of thousands of years, the behavior kept appearing again and again. Independently, repeatedly. As if something about intelligence past a certain threshold makes the practice almost inevitable. By the time you reach the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 30,000 years ago, burial had become elaborate. At the site of Sungir in Russia, archaeologists uncovered 2 children buried head to head, covered in thousands of individually carved ivory beads that would have taken, by some estimates, thousands of hours of labor to produce. Thousands of hours spent on people who could no longer use, wear, or appreciate any of it. That's not practical. That's not hygiene. That is a community collectively deciding that some things matter more than efficiency. And this is where the historical story quietly becomes a story about you. Because you still do this. You spend money on funerals you know the deceased will never see. You choose caskets, flowers, headstones with inscriptions meant to be read by the living, not the dead. You visit graves decades later, sometimes talking out loud to someone who cannot hear you. None of it is efficient. None of it is required for survival. And yet you do it anyway. The same way a hunter-gatherer in school once placed a deer antler into a child's arms 100,000 years ago. Psychologists studying grief today, including work building on the continuing bonds model developed by researchers Dennis Klass, Phyllis Silverman, and Stephen Nickman in the 1990s, have found that maintaining a connection to the deceased, rather than achieving a clean psychological break, is actually associated with healthier long-term grieving. In other words, that impulse to keep a relationship alive even after death isn't a glitch in your grieving process. It might be the entire point of it, which raises an uncomfortable question. Are you burying the dead for their sake? Or for yours? The evidence increasingly points toward the second answer. The dead don't need a grave. They don't need a headstone, or a bouquet, or an anniversary visit. Burial was never really for them. It was always for the living, a way of processing an absence too large to simply walk away from. That reframes everything. This wasn't a ritual invented to honor death. It was a ritual invented to survive it. Every civilization that has ever existed has developed some version of this practice, whether through burial, cremation, sky burial, or elaborate tomb building, because every civilization has faced the exact same problem. What do you do with love once the person it was pointed at is gone? You bury it, or you burn it, or you carve it into stone so that grief has somewhere to go besides nowhere. Neanderthals may have understood that tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote it down. Homo Naledi, with a brain a third the size of yours, may have understood it too. And somewhere between those distant relatives and you, standing over a grave with a flower in your hand, that understanding never left. Tonight, when you think about someone you've lost, and you find yourself talking to them anyway, even though you know they can't hear you, remember that this isn't strange. It's ancient. It's one of the oldest things your species has ever done, stretching back before language, before farming, before cities. There's another piece of this story worth sitting with, because it changes how you might think about grief itself. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups that live in ways loosely comparable to your distant ancestors, have found enormous variation in how death is handled. Some communities bury quickly, within hours. Others keep remains close for months, moving them along with the group. Some cultures speak the names of the dead constantly, weaving them into daily conversation. Others avoid saying a dead person's name at all, believing it might call them back. On the surface, these look like opposite approaches. But underneath, they're solving the exact same problem in different ways. How do you keep a relationship structured, coherent, and bearable once one half of it has permanently stopped responding? Your brain, it turns out, is not built to simply delete someone the moment they die. Neuroscientists studying grief have found that areas of the brain associated with reward and attachment, The same regions activated when you think about people you love while they're alive remain active when bereaved people think about someone they've lost. Your brain, in a very real sense, doesn't fully update its model of the world. Part of it still expects that person to walk through the door. Burial, in this light, isn't just a cultural custom. It might be one of the earliest tools your species invented to manage a neurological problem that has no clean solution. A physical place to redirect an emotional signal that has nowhere left to go. Think about what this means for something as small as visiting a grave on an anniversary. You're not doing it because logic demands it. You're doing it because some ancient piece of your wiring still treats the relationship as ongoing, and the visit gives that piece of you somewhere to put its energy. Now think back to Sungir, to those two children buried beneath thousands of hand-carved ivory beads. Imagine the person who carved those beads, bead by bead, for hours, for days, working ivory into tiny, imperfect circles, knowing the moment their work went into the ground, it would be gone forever, buried, unseen, unused. Why would anyone do that? Unless the beads were never really about the children at all. Unless they were about everyone standing at the edge of that grave, needing some physical, exhausting, tangible way to show what an absence like this was worth. The effort was the message. The days of labor were the proof. In a species without money, without written records, without any way to quantify loss, physical effort may have been the only currency capable of expressing something too large for words. That idea doesn't disappear over tens of thousands of years. It just changes shape. You see it today in the price of caskets, in the size of headstones, in the sheer scale that funerals can reach, even in cultures that pride themselves on frugality in every other part of life. Somewhere, without ever being taught the reasoning, you already understand that grief has to cost something, that an unmarked, effortless goodbye feels wrong, even if you couldn't explain exactly why. Look at how far this pattern travels once you start searching for it. In ancient Egypt, bodies were preserved for an afterlife journey, packed with food, jewelry, and even furniture, on the assumption the dead would need it later. In parts of Madagascar, some communities practice a tradition called Famadi Hana, where the remains of ancestors are periodically exhumed, rewrapped in fresh cloth, and celebrated with music and dancing, keeping the relationship between living and dead visibly, physically alive. In Tibetan sky burial, bodies are left exposed on mountaintops for vultures, not out of neglect, but out of a belief that returning the body to nature and to other living creatures is itself an act of generosity. 3 cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years of independent development, arriving at wildly different rituals built on the exact same emotional foundation. The dead cannot simply be discarded like an object. Something has to be done. Something has to mark the fact that a person, not a thing, is gone. Even the objects placed in graves tell a consistent story once you compare them across time. Grave goods discovered from Ice Age Europe to Bronze Age China to the burial mounds of early medieval England share a strange pattern. They are rarely the most practical items available. They are the most meaningful ones. Weapons belonging to a warrior. A child's favorite toy, small enough to have been worn smooth by tiny hands. Musical instruments buried with musicians. The logic isn't survival. The logic is identity. Whoever is doing the burying seems to be saying, in the only language available to them, "This is who you were, and I want that to be remembered, even here, even now." There's one more thread worth pulling before this story closes. If burial really did emerge, at least in part, from something as simple as unresolved attachment, then it suggests grief isn't a uniquely human invention either. It suggests it's older than your species, older than Homo sapiens. Something that existed in the minds of Neanderthals at Shanidar, and possibly in the small-brained hominins who carried their dead into a cave chamber in South Africa that most adult humans today can barely fit through. Which means that flower on the grave tonight isn't a symbol you invented. It's a signal being passed down an unbroken chain of hands, reaching back further than any language, any religion, any nation that has ever existed. You're not performing a ritual invented by any single culture. You're continuing one that outlived every species who may have started it. Before you go, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new today. If you did, please take a second to like the video and subscribe for more fun science and history explainers just like this. It really helps the channel and lets me keep making content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.